This was supposed to be just another documentary, another headline, another story people would watch, react to, and eventually move on from like so many others before it. At first, everything followed that familiar pattern. There was anticipation, early buzz, conversations building up before the release. And then it dropped, hitting audiences with exactly the kind of intensity people expected. But what happened next? That's what no one was prepared for. Because the moment the explosive documentary connected to 50 Cent and centered around T.I. started gaining traction, something unexpected began unfolding behind the scenes. It didn't stay contained within the screen. It didn't remain just a piece of content. Instead, it spilled over into real life in a way that immediately changed how people saw everything. The women featured in the documentary, the very voices that carried the emotional weight of the story, didn't fade into the background once filming was over. They didn't quietly step away after sharing their experiences. And they didn't simply allow the narrative to stand as it was presented. Instead, they began to speak. Slowly at first, almost subtle enough to miss. But what they started saying quickly caught attention, because their words didn't just add to the story, they challenged it. They introduced new claims, new details, and emotions that people hadn't fully seen on screen. And as those statements began circulating, it became clear that what audiences had watched might not have been the complete picture. According to individuals close to the production, some of these women are now expressing that what was shown in the documentary represented only a fraction of what actually happened. That realization hit hard, because if what viewers already saw felt intense, emotional, and at times unsettling, then the idea that there was more, much more, immediately raised serious questions. What didn't make it into the final cut? Why were certain moments excluded? Who made those decisions? And more importantly, what are these women revealing now that's making people look back at the entire documentary differently? As the conversation grew, a pattern began to emerge. Some of the women hinted that their stories weren't completely altered, but they were shaped, adjusted, presented in a way that guided how the audience would interpret them. Not necessarily false, but not fully complete either. And that distinction matters, because when real experiences are involved, even small shifts in presentation can change the entire meaning. Now, those same voices are stepping forward again, adding context, expanding on details, and in some cases directly addressing what they feel was left out. It's not just about telling their stories anymore, it's about reclaiming them. And that leads to one of the biggest questions driving this entire situation. Why now? Why speak out after the documentary has already been released and consumed by the public? According to some insiders, something happened behind the scenes after the project dropped. Something that hasn't been fully explained yet, but enough to push these women to come forward. Enough to make them feel like staying silent was no longer an option. And that implication alone has added a new layer of tension to everything, because it suggests that what's happening now isn't random, it's a reaction. Before all of this started unraveling, before the statements, the speculation, and the growing tension, there was just the documentary itself, a project that had people talking from the moment it was announced. Because when 50 Cent attaches his name to something, people already know it's not going to be subtle. His reputation isn't built on quiet storytelling. It's built on impact, controversy, and moments that force attention. And that energy was present from the very beginning of this project. Even the early teasers carried a certain tone, dark, serious, deliberate. They hinted at deeper stories, ones that felt emotional, complicated, and at times unresolved. At the center of it all were the women, not as background figures or secondary voices, but as the core of the narrative. Their experiences, their perspectives, and their emotions drove everything forward. And when the documentary was finally released, it delivered exactly what it promised, something heavy, something that sparked reactions immediately. Viewers weren't just watching passively. They were engaging, discussing, debating. Clips began circulating almost instantly, highlighting moments where the women described situations that felt tense, personal, and at times difficult to fully process. But even in those early reactions, something stood out. While the documentary presented a strong narrative, it didn't answer everything. There were moments that felt incomplete, segments that seemed to end abruptly, details that hinted at something deeper but never fully explored it, and people noticed. They paused, rewound, and questioned. Not loudly at first, but enough to create a subtle sense that something might be missing, that there was more beneath the surface that hadn't been shown. Behind the scenes, those feelings weren't entirely unexpected, because according to people close to the production, not everyone involved felt fully comfortable with how things were presented. At the time, that didn't seem unusual. Documentaries, especially ones dealing with complex and emotional topics, always involve editing. Hours of footage are condensed into a structured story. Moments are rearranged, trimmed, and shaped to fit a narrative. That's standard. But in this case, the concerns weren't just about time or structure. They were about how the stories were framed, what was emphasized, what was softened, and what was left out entirely. Adding to that complexity was the presence of T.I. throughout the project. Whether directly or indirectly, his influence was always there. Not always visible, not always the focus, but impossible to ignore. And that created another layer to the situation. Because now it wasn't just about storytelling, it was about perception, about reputation, about who controls the narrative and how that narrative is received. When real people and real experiences are involved, every decision carries weight. Every cut and every inclusion can shift how the story is understood. At first, none of this reached the public in a major way. The documentary was released, reactions came in, and the conversation moved forward as expected. For a brief moment, it seemed like everything would follow the usual cycle: attention, discussion, and then gradual silence. But then something shifted, and it didn't happen all at once. It started quietly, almost easy to overlook. One of the women featured in the documentary made a simple post. Nothing dramatic, nothing overly detailed, just a few words. But those words changed everything. Instead of promoting the documentary or aligning with the narrative that had been presented, she said something unexpected. "There's more to my story than what was shown." That was it. No accusations, no elaboration. But that single statement hit harder than any scene in the documentary itself, because it immediately reframed everything. Now people weren't just thinking about what they had watched, they were thinking about what they hadn't seen. That one sentence opened the door to a completely different perspective. It suggested that the documentary, despite its intensity and emotional weight, might not have told the full story. And once that idea entered the conversation, it spread quickly. Others began to pay closer attention. They revisited scenes, reconsidered moments, and started connecting details in new ways. What followed was a gradual but undeniable shift in how the documentary was perceived. It was no longer just a finished product. It became something else, a starting point for a larger conversation. A conversation about editing, about narrative control, and about whose voices are fully heard versus partially presented. And as more voices began to emerge, that conversation only grew louder. Now the story isn't just about what was shown on screen. It's about everything surrounding it, the decisions behind it, the reactions after it, and the voices that are continuing to shape it even now. And with each new statement, each new detail, the situation becomes more complex. Because the more that comes out, the clearer it becomes that this isn't as simple as it once seemed. It's not just a documentary anymore. It's an evolving story, one that's still unfolding in real time. And if what's being hinted at is true, then what we've seen so far might only be the beginning. The moment the documentary ended, a strange silence hung in the air for just under 7 minutes. Then, at 6 minutes and 58 seconds, the first quiet voice appeared online. It was subtle, almost hesitant, as if the person posting wasn't entirely sure she should be speaking at all. But once that single voice broke through, the floodgates opened. Others quickly realized they were not alone in their feelings, and the hesitation dissolved. Within days, more posts began surfacing from different women, each with their own tone and style, yet all carrying the same underlying message. What viewers had seen was not the complete picture. Just like that, the narrative shifted dramatically. The documentary was no longer viewed as the definitive final word on the subject. Instead, it became merely the beginning. The real story started unfolding in real time, not within the polished frames of the film, but outside it, in raw social media posts, heated comment sections, and unfiltered personal statements that often felt uncomfortable and deeply personal. Suddenly, the central question was no longer solely about events from the past. It expanded to include what was happening right now, in the present moment. Why were these women choosing to speak up only after T.I.'s documentary had been released? What had finally pushed them to break their long-held silence? And perhaps most critically, what exactly were they about to reveal that had not made it into the final cut of the film? The answers to these questions promised to take the entire conversation in a direction no one had anticipated, transforming what had begun as a structured documentary into something far more intense, unpredictable, and emotionally charged. At first, when the initial posts appeared, many assumed they stemmed from simple frustration. Perhaps the women felt misrepresented or believed certain nuances of their experiences had been overlooked. Some observers hoped it would be a temporary reaction that would fade away once the initial wave of attention passed. However, that hope proved short-lived. The situation escalated rapidly. Within 48 hours, what had started as subtle, cautious hints evolved into far more direct and pointed accusations. One woman, whose segment in the documentary had already gone viral and sparked widespread discussion, published a longer, more detailed message. This time, her words were neither vague nor carefully worded. They were emotional, specific, and unflinching. A single line from that post spread like wildfire across platforms. What you saw was edited to make things look less serious than they really were. That phrase alone changed everything. It suggested that the issue was not merely the omission of minor details, but something deeper and more troubling. The reality of these women's experiences may have been significantly more intense, more uncomfortable, and more serious than what the audience had been shown. Viewers began returning to the documentary, rewatching key clips, pausing at critical moments, and scrutinizing every frame in an attempt to identify what might have been cut or altered. The tension continued to build as people tried to piece together the missing parts of the puzzle. Just as that scrutiny intensified, another woman stepped forward. This time, she did not limit herself to a written post. Instead, she released a raw, unfiltered video, speaking directly into the camera with no production polish, no background music, and no careful editing. From the very first seconds, the difference in tone was unmistakable. This was not the measured, controlled delivery audiences had seen in the documentary. Her voice carried frustration, vulnerability, and at times, a visible tremor of emotion. She began by saying, "I watched the documentary and I didn't recognize parts of my own story." That statement landed heavily. Not recognizing one's own story implies that significant changes had been made, elements rearranged, emphasis shifted, or context stripped away in ways that altered the fundamental meaning. This distinction was significant. Emotion and personal perception often shape the deeper meaning of events far more than bare facts alone. If the emotional reality experienced by the participants differed substantially from what the documentary conveyed, then the entire tone and impact of the film might be fundamentally misaligned with the truth. She did not stop at that general observation. She began describing certain moments as far more intense than they had appeared on screen, offering hints rather than full details, but making it clear that a great deal remained hidden beneath the surface. Then, in the middle of her live stream, came a revelation that seemed to come out of nowhere and dramatically raise the stakes. "There were things we talked about that were supposed to stay between us," she stated. The phrase hung in the air, forcing listeners to pause and absorb its full weight. The idea that certain conversations had been intended to remain private suggested an expectation of trust and confidentiality. It implied that participants had shared deeply personal or sensitive information with the understanding that it would not be made public, or at least not presented in a particular way. Now she appeared to suggest that this boundary may have been crossed. The immediate reaction online was explosive. Speculation ran wild. Had private conversations been recorded or used without full consent? Were off-the-record discussions incorporated into the final project against the participants' expectations? The controversy was no longer confined to technical editing choices. It had expanded into serious questions about professional boundaries, informed consent, and the ethical line between responsible storytelling and potential overreach. As these revelations multiplied, the public began asking even more pointed questions. Had all the participants been fully aware of exactly how their stories would ultimately be presented? Did everyone involved agree to the same overarching narrative framework? And were there moments during production where the distinction between legitimate documentary filmmaking and something more manipulative had become uncomfortably blurred? Although none of these allegations had been officially confirmed by the production team at that stage, the questions refused to fade away. They continued to gain momentum as more voices joined the conversation. In the midst of this growing storm, a subtle but powerful development occurred. While the spotlight remained fixed on the women speaking out, an old clip from the documentary itself began circulating again on social media. This time, however, viewers approached it with a completely different mindset. They were no longer watching passively as an audience. They were examining the footage like investigators, searching for clues in every gesture and expression. One particular moment that had previously seemed insignificant now drew intense scrutiny. A brief hesitation from one of the women before she answered a question. At the time of the original release, it had appeared to be nothing more than ordinary nervousness in front of the camera. But when viewed through the lens of everything that had since been revealed, that small pause took on new meaning. It began to feel less like simple anxiety and more like the visible sign of something left unsaid, a momentary crack in the controlled presentation. This kind of retrospective analysis intensified the overall atmosphere. It was no longer just about the new information being shared in real time. The emerging story was also about how previously overlooked details were now connecting in unexpected ways. Pieces that had once seemed unimportant or easily explained were starting to look like potential clues to a larger, more complicated truth. The more people revisited the documentary with fresh eyes, the more they found themselves wondering whether the film had ever truly been intended to present the full, unvarnished picture, or had it always been designed as a carefully curated version of events, one that prioritized a particular narrative over complete transparency. The entire situation had evolved into something far more complex than a simple debate over documentary techniques. It had become a broader examination of power dynamics in storytelling, the responsibilities of filmmakers toward their subjects, and the fragile trust that exists between participants and producers. With each new post, live stream, or re-examined clip, the original documentary receded further into the background as the real-time unfolding drama took center stage. What had begun as a polished exploration of difficult experiences was now being challenged, dissected, and potentially rewritten by the very women whose voices had given it life. The process had grown messy, emotionally charged, and increasingly difficult to contain, leaving many to wonder how much more would eventually come to light and what the ultimate impact on all those involved would be. As the controversy deepened, many began to wonder whether the documentary they had watched was merely one version of a much larger and more complex story. Just when it seemed the situation had reached its emotional peak and could not intensify any further, another powerful wave of reactions swept across the internet. These responses came not only from ordinary viewers, but also from voices within the industry and from commentators who had been following every development. People suddenly realized that this was far from over. Almost overnight, the documentary ceased to be viewed simply as a film. It transformed into something far more contentious, a full-scale battle over truth itself. Then one particular reaction shifted the tone of the entire conversation. A short, blurry clip of alleged behind-the-scenes footage began circulating widely. It was brief, unverified, and of poor quality, yet its content proved explosive. In the clip, an unclear voice could be heard saying, "We can't include that. It changes everything." The line struck like a shock wave through online communities. If authentic, it appeared to confirm precisely what many had begun to suspect, that certain elements of the story had been intentionally withheld because they would have altered the audience's understanding in a fundamental way. The discussion immediately moved from speculation into something far more serious. What exactly had been left out? Why would its inclusion have changed everything? The sense that the controversy was much bigger than anyone had initially realized grew stronger with every share and comment. In the midst of this escalating chaos, another quieter but equally powerful development occurred. Several of the women who had been most vocal in speaking out suddenly went silent. There were no new posts, no follow-up videos, and no further clarifications. This abrupt silence proved deeply unsettling for many observers. Rather than calming the situation, it heightened anxiety because it suggested that something significant might be happening behind the scenes, conversations, negotiations, or pressures that the public could not see. The lack of resolution only fueled the speculation. With no official response from the documentary's producers addressing the growing list of concerns, the tension continued to rise. The story remained suspended in a state of unresolved anticipation, building pressure as everyone waited for the next development. Just when it felt as though the situation had reached its peak intensity and every possible angle had been explored, one final detail surfaced. This revelation did not come from a major headline, a prominent social media account, or even directly from one of the women. Instead, it emerged from something that many people had already seen but had largely overlooked or failed to fully understand at the time. Someone decided to re-examine the documentary with fresh eyes, but this time they ignored the main interviews and obvious dramatic moments. Instead, they focused on the transitions, the quick cuts between scenes, the brief bridging segments that most viewers usually paid little attention to, the parts where the editing itself became almost invisible. What they noticed in those seemingly minor transitions began to reshape how the entire documentary was perceived. Subtle inconsistencies in lighting, slight changes in the women's expressions or body language between cuts, and brief moments where audio levels or background sounds did not quite match started to stand out. These small details, once dismissed as standard post-production polishing, now appeared potentially revealing. They suggested places where material might have been carefully rearranged or removed entirely. The realization that even the invisible elements of editing could carry meaning added yet another layer of complexity to the unfolding drama. What had begun as a polished documentary had now become the center of a much larger conversation about transparency, power, trust, and the ethics of how personal stories are told, or withheld, on screen. The absence of any clear resolution only kept the story alive and growing. With each new layer of analysis, each silent pause from the participants, and each industry reaction, the original film receded further into the background. In its place stood a live, evolving controversy that continued to challenge assumptions about truth, storytelling, and accountability. Whether this final detail would lead to concrete answers, official statements, or simply deeper divisions remained uncertain. What was clear, however, was that the documentary had sparked something far larger than itself. A passionate, uncomfortable, and still unfolding debate about how stories are constructed, and whose voices ultimately shape what the public is allowed to. As the screen fades and the audio shifts during those quick transitions that normally pass unnoticed, the story appears to move forward without interruption. Most viewers pay little attention to such technical elements, but this time someone did. What they discovered in one of those brief moments fundamentally altered the way the entire documentary was perceived. In a split-second fade between two segments, a faint piece of audio lingered, just quiet enough and brief enough that it would have been easy to miss entirely. When curious viewers slowed the footage down and isolated the sound, the result sent chills through anyone who heard it. A voice, its owner unclear, says plainly, "That's not what we agreed on." The phrase hung heavily once it began circulating. "That's not what we agreed on." The words raised immediate and troubling questions. Agreed on what exactly? What had been promised regarding how these women's stories would be handled? What was supposed to be shown, and what was supposed to remain hidden? If the audio clip was authentic, it pointed to the existence of prior expectations, formal or informal agreements, and shared understandings about the boundaries of the project. It suggested that somewhere along the line, something had deviated from the original plan. The discovery injected a new level of seriousness into the ongoing controversy, making the earlier complaints from the participants feel far more substantiated than simple post-release regret. The final twist arrived shortly after the audio began spreading widely. One of the women who had gone completely silent in recent days suddenly reappeared with a single, concise post. There was no lengthy explanation, no emotional outpouring, just a short statement that carried significant weight. "I stayed quiet because I thought it would pass. But that clip, that's exactly how it felt." Her words served as a form of confirmation, not of specific factual details or particular events, but of the broader emotional atmosphere that many had sensed throughout the unfolding drama. It validated the feeling that something had been misaligned, that the final product did not fully match what the participants had expected or understood when they agreed to take part. For the first time, that intangible sense of unease had been given. A clear voice and public acknowledgement. Yet the situation quickly grew even more unsettling. Shortly after her post appeared, it was deleted without any explanation or follow-up. The sudden removal left observers with yet another fragment of a story that seemed to be revealed and then deliberately pulled back at the same moment. This pattern of partial disclosure only intensified the tension. At this stage, there was no longer a single coherent version of events. Instead, multiple overlapping layers existed simultaneously. The polished narrative presented in the original documentary, the raw and evolving statements from the women, the alleged behind-the-scenes insights, and now these subtle technical details hidden in transitions that hinted at deeper issues throughout the entire production process. None of these versions aligned perfectly with the others, and that misalignment was becoming impossible to ignore. When personal stories, official accounts, and supporting evidence fail to line up, it almost always signals that more remains unsaid. There appeared to be elements that had not been fully revealed, moments that had not been shown, and perhaps truths that certain parties preferred to keep from full public understanding. If the documentary had truly captured everything accurately and transparently, the current situation would likely never have arisen. There would have been no wave of women speaking out, no resurfaced clips under new scrutiny, and no faint audio slipping through the editing process only to be discovered later. The persistent tension suggested that the matter remained unresolved and far from finished. It felt instead like something continued to unfold quietly behind the scenes, hidden from view. The uncertainty centered on several key unknowns. What exactly had been agreed upon during the early stages of production? How and why had those agreements apparently changed? What conversations had taken place that were never captured on camera? Which critical details had been deliberately left out? And what reasoning had driven those choices? Most pressingly, what might these women choose to reveal next if they decided to stop holding back entirely? If their current statements already carried this much weight, the prospect of them speaking even more openly raised the possibility that the entire narrative could shift dramatically once again, in ways no one was prepared for. This left the central question hanging over the entire controversy. Were people witnessing the aftermath of a completed project, Or were they actually watching the early stages of something much larger and more consequential? A growing number of observers felt that the full story had not yet emerged, not even close. The situation was layered, emotionally complex, and still actively developing in real time right before the public's eyes. Taking a step back, it is worth reflecting carefully on everything that has surfaced so far. This is not a straightforward disagreement or a simple case of hurt feelings after a film's release. It involves deeper issues of trust, consent, editorial control, and the ethical responsibilities that come with telling other people's deeply personal stories. The women's accounts suggest that their experiences were reshaped in the final cut in ways that altered both tone and impact. The discovery of the faint audio clip adds weight to suspicions that internal disagreements existed about what should and should not be included. The subsequent deletion of a confirming post only heightens the sense that forces are at work attempting to manage or contain the narrative even now. At the heart of the debate lies a series of important questions that deserve honest consideration. Do you believe the women who have come forward, or do you think their reactions are being amplified and blown out of proportion after the fact, perhaps influenced by the intense online environment? Regarding the documentary itself, did it succeed in telling the full, unvarnished story, or did it present only a carefully curated version shaped by production decisions? Is it reasonable to conclude that important moments were intentionally omitted, or were the cuts simply standard editorial choices required to craft a coherent film within time constraints? And what exactly should we make of that short audio clip? Does the line, "That's not what we agreed on," represent concrete evidence of broken promises and manipulated storytelling? Or could it be taken out of context, perhaps referring to something far more mundane, like a minor scheduling matter or a late creative adjustment? These questions do not have easy answers, and reasonable people can reach different conclusions based on the available information. Some will continue to trust the filmmaker's judgment, arguing that crafting a compelling documentary necessarily involves difficult choices, and that not every participant will feel perfectly represented in the end. Others will side more strongly with the women, seeing patterns of control and selective presentation that undermine the project's claim to authenticity. The truth likely sits somewhere in the messy middle, where good intentions collide with practical limitations, personal sensitivities, and the inevitable power imbalance between producers and subjects. What cannot be denied is that the controversy has exposed real vulnerabilities in how documentary storytelling is conducted, especially when dealing with sensitive, trauma-related material. The absence of any comprehensive official response from the production team has allowed speculation to flourish unchecked. The sudden silences from some participants, followed by brief reappearances and deletions, only add to the atmosphere of uncertainty. Meanwhile, the public continues to dissect both the film and the surrounding reactions with increasing intensity. This story remains very much alive and capable of shifting again at any moment. If additional women decide to speak out more forcefully, if further behind-the-scenes details or raw footage leak into the public domain, or if more audio or visual evidence surfaces, the entire situation could transform once more. The debate touches on fundamental issues: the nature of truth in nonfiction filmmaking, the importance of informed consent, the boundaries of editorial freedom, and the responsibility creators bear toward the real people whose lives they portray. For now, the tension continues to build without clear resolution. The documentary that once seemed like a straightforward exploration of difficult experiences has become the focal point of a much broader conversation about transparency, power, and accountability in storytelling. Whether this unfolding drama ultimately leads to greater clarity, revised versions of the narrative, public apologies, or simply deeper divisions depends on what emerges next. One thing feels certain: the full picture has not yet been revealed. The The story is still evolving, and its next chapter may prove even more revealing than everything that has come before. In the meantime, the conversation belongs to everyone following it. Different perspectives matter because they help illuminate blind spots and challenge assumptions on all sides. The situation serves as a reminder that stories, especially those drawn from real lives, are rarely as simple as they first appear on screen. Behind every polished documentary lies a complex web of decisions, compromises, hopes, and sometimes disappointments that rarely make it into the final cut. The screen may have faded to black at the end of the film, but the real discussion is only gaining momentum. Whatever comes next, the questions raised will likely linger long after the immediate controversy subsides, encouraging both creators and audiences to think more critically about the stories we tell and the ways we choose to tell them.